As you begin this course, it's worth taking a moment to consider what we mean by the term ASL. On the one hand, ASL is often used to refer to any signs that are used in the United States, as well as in some parts of Canada, Puerto Rico, Central America, and a few other islands. But in fact, American Sign Language is a language in and of itself that isn't influenced by English word order. As a result, sometimes people use the term ASL incorrectly, or I should say they use it in a non-technical sense. For it's true that most people use the word ASL in that non-technical sense to just mean any of the signs that are used, whether they come in English word order or in a particular unique word order, a particular unique usage that is a separate language. So you have to be careful between the lay use, the common use of the term American Sign Language to just mean any group of signs used in the US and in these other areas, from the linguistic use of the term American Sign Language, which is a particular form of language, a particular form of the sign language that is found in the United States, but it's minimally influenced by English. So in a linguistics class, when we talk about American Sign Language, we're not talking about the groups of signs that are often used by hearing people that often use some made-up initialized versions of signs that may in fact follow English word order exactly. In fact, many hearing people might even speak English while they're using this form of sign language. In the non-technical sense, people will say, oh yeah, those are the ASL signs, that's the signs used in the US, but that's not what we mean in this class. In fact, even when we say what deaf people sign, we might not be referring to the specific form of sign language that we're analyzing here. Because deaf people often move back and forth between using American Sign Language in the technical sense and using some forms of sign language that mirror English. And when they're using those forms of sign language that mirror English, then they're not using ASL as we mean it here. In our course, whenever we're talking about American Sign Language, we're talking about the sign language that's used by culturally deaf people that has been passed down for generations. This is the sign language used by native signers, that is, deaf people who grow up with parents who are deaf and who use the language. This is the language that's used with minimal influence from English. Now notice I say minimal influence because even with a natural separate language, there will be some influences from other languages. Much like even though we speak English, we occasionally borrow words from Spanish, like taco, or words from French or German or Latin. But we know that we're speaking English. We're not trying to speak Spanish while we speak English or trying to mirror German as we speak English. We just borrow a few words or phrases here and there. Well, in the same way, American Sign Language is a separate language from English. Though it may occasionally borrow a few words here and there, it's not an attempt to copy English or mirror English. And so whenever we want to think about what American Sign Language is for the purposes of linguistic analysis, we want to think about the way ASL has been signed by native signers across the generations, the way ASL has been preserved in deaf schools, in deaf clubs, and in other deaf organizations by deaf people who grew up using the language natively. So, what can we say about ASL? This ASL, the ASL we're talking about in the linguistic sense, is rule governed. Now these are not the rules that we find in textbooks. These are the rules that we find in the heads of the speakers. The speakers don't look at books to decide what word order they should use or how they should form a sign. They simply know the rules. They learned them growing up from their parents, from teachers at the school for the deaf, from older people in the deaf community, just the way you learned to speak English even before you went to school. ASL does have its own word order, and that word order is separate from English. Just like English can use lots of different word orders to express an idea, so too can ASL use lots of word orders to express an idea. But these organizations of sentences and phrases are different from the ones that we find in English, or at least they're different most of the time. ASL is not just signing pictures. Sometimes people have been taught in their ASL 1 or 2 that they need to think visually and they need to sign the picture. And while it's true that sometimes ASL does show movements and actions in a very visual and gestural way, ASL is not completely iconic. That is, unless you've studied ASL, you wouldn't be able to understand it the same way you could understand a mime or something like that. Also, we need to remember, as I said in the previous slide, that ASL is not what you always see when you see people signing, even if these people are deaf people. For instance, if you have a deaf friend who grew up at a school that was a hearing school, where perhaps they used many forms of signed English and used interpreters or hearing teachers, your deaf friend may have learned to sign, and in the non-technical sense, they may use ASL. But in the technical sense, the language that they use may not be ASL. So we have to be careful not to think that just because we have a deaf friend who signs one way, that they're signing ASL in the sense that we mean it in this course. Remember, ASL is the language that's been preserved by the community in its most pure form. The language that's been preserved by native signers. That doesn't mean that you will never see English influences. It doesn't mean that occasionally there will be English word orders or even signs that have been borrowed from C sign. But these are signs that have been accepted by the deaf culture and passed on in the deaf culture from signer to signer and generation to generation. That's why ASL is often referred to as the heart of the deaf community, as its most prized possession. And that's why it's important that we as hearing people who are learning American Sign Language be very careful not to take it lightly and not to abuse it as we are learning it. One final note. Do not think of ASL as simply the opposite of English. Sometimes people think, oh, well, the English word order is, I teach class. Therefore, that can't be the ASL word order. But that's not the case. Sometimes it just so happens that the ASL word order is the same as the English word order. Whenever you're trying to think of how something should be signed in ASL, don't think to yourself, what's the English? Do something different. That's the wrong way to go about it. Think to yourself, what do native signers do? What can we see native signers doing? Oftentimes that's going to look very different from English, but occasionally it's going to look very similar. And that's okay. Remember, the deaf community is the standard. What the deaf community uses is the standard.